Hi friends, Molten here and welcome back. Today I'm going to go over some games I played in the Under-16 Olympiad in 2007 in Singapore, which is one of my favorite events I've ever played in. And it was a team event which consisted of myself, Junter Ikeda, Max Illingworth, Raymond Song and Lindsay Zhen. And there was an absolute dream team at the time. So I had the fortune of representing on board 1 and playing some really talented juniors who would go on to become some of the strongest players in the world. And I'm going to go over 3 particular moments in the tournament which I clearly remember, which were really important lessons for me. So I hope you stick around and enjoy the games. So this first game I played against Anas, a very talented junior from Malaysia. I reached this particular middle game with the 2 bishops intact. Usually in 2 bishop positions, you want to use the bishop which your opponent doesn't have. In this case, it would be the light squared bishop. And at the time, I was also a lot more aggressive than I am now. And there was really no positional play in me at all. So I was really trying to force things quite a bit. Here, we don't necessarily have to force anything, but we do have a forcing option if we want to try and make something happen. And that's the continuation I went for. So if you want to try and work that out, take a few moments to pause the video. Otherwise, in the particular game, I went pawn to a4, pawn to b4. So if black captured that pawn, I just take back with the weak a6 pawn. And the whole idea of this a4 pawn push is to take away this c4 square, as you'll see, and set up this particular sacrifice. In fact, I went for the wrong sacrifice. I should have played the move knight takes e6, which I saw in the game but dismissed it because of the move queen c4. But as I can see now that it doesn't actually work, because queen takes c4, rook takes c4, I have the move rook takes e7 here. And black can't capture back because the rook would hang, so I win the piece back. In fact, I went for the wrong rook sacrifice in the game by playing rook takes e6, and after pawn takes I went knight takes e6, which looks good but it doesn't actually win anything. After the move queen c4, my idea was just to take, and then here I would be winning because of rook takes on d5. But of course my opponent didn't do that. My opponent just played the move queen to e5. After which taking the rook wouldn't work, because after rook takes I just didn't see a continuation to win my piece back. Instead I went for knight to f4, which was the idea. But this involves an exchange sacrifice. So we played a few checks here to gain some time on the clock, and eventually my opponent avoided the draw for me by playing the move bishop to c5. I played knight takes d5, knight takes d5, bishop f4, and the problem here is that there's no targets for white to really attack. So despite having 2 pawns for the sacrifice exchange, there's no way for me to make use of that, and there's no way to create any passed pawns. The game continued like this, and even though I tried to create some queen batteries, it just wasn't enough and eventually fizzled out into a draw. So this following game was probably my luckiest win and biggest swindle from the event. It also came in a moment where we really needed some crucial points, and in a single player event where you get into a bad position, it's okay because it's just due, but in a team event it feels extra worse because you're letting the team down. So I remember feeling really bad for even getting into this particular position, and it was probably the final straw for playing the French defense for me in terms of getting these close positions. But in this particular situation here, my opponent played the move pawn to b4. I dropped the bishop back to b6. As we can see, white has a lot of ways to continue the attack. Bishop to a4 was played to bring the bishop to b3, put pressure here on d5. Therefore, I snapped this knight off in order to defend my pawn on d5. Of course, at the same time, I'm trying to get some counterplay on the white king, but I mean the position should be lost here. Still, g5 was tried, rook h6, pawn to g4, tried to block things with knight to g6, and the only thing you can really do in a bad position like this is just to make it as difficult as possible for your opponent, and hopefully you get some tactics which go your way. Queen e7, Bishop goes back. I played queen d7 to defend the pawn on f5. Queen g5 is played. Rook across to defend everything. And now the queen is invading on f6. I played the king back. And we see white has a very pleasant position. There's many ways here to continue the game, but there's no straight up wins, at least not easy ones straight off the bat. So at least your opponent will have to work to find these. After bishop takes, knight takes here on f4 was played. Rook check. King goes to d7. Bishop goes across. Traded queens here and rook across. Rook goes across. Took, and already I was starting to feel that I had maybe some vague chances already, because after the move pawn to d4, I was allowed to capture this pawn on a2, and then all of a sudden I have a passed a pawn. So the most important thing when you're winning is just not to allow too much counterplay. And here I feel like I'm getting a little bit too much. Push the pawn up the board. Played knight takes f6, bishop d3, bishop takes a2, bishop takes, and my only hope here is to promote this g pawn. And as white here, you just want to get rid of this last chance. But of course, if you've been winning the whole entire game, a draw is probably the last thing that's on your mind, and I can understand why white would be really pushing hard here to try and convert his advantage. But maybe at some point you sort of need to bail. After the move king e6, bishop went back, and now all of a sudden after move king f5, the bishop can't even go to f4 anymore, and there's no way for white to really win this pawn on g3. After the move bishop g2, we have captures, and king g4, and all of a sudden there's no way for white to win this pawn on g3, and it's looking extremely dangerous. Knight d5, bishop goes across, and knight check, and now black is promoting the pawn after the g2. Bishop to b6, knight d5, bishop a7, and simply the move pawn to b6 is good enough because the knight is heading in towards the e2 square. So this is just an example of why you shouldn't necessarily give the game up right away, and you should just try to make things as difficult as possible for your opponent, and hopefully that's enough to sort of swing the game back in your way if you get a few miscalculations. So now we get into my game against Wesley, but before I played this game I remember I was actually quite down. I felt like I dropped a lot of draws and I was letting the team down by not scoring enough points, and that's when our team captain really calmed me down and said that it was actually totally fine, and even if he was playing on board 1 at the Olympiad, drawing all the games would be a fantastic result. And that's really when I sort of changed my mindset a bit towards the event, and I felt that as long as I wasn't losing my games and I was trying my best, then that would be enough. And especially against an opponent like Wesley, who at this point in time towards the end of the event hadn't dropped any points at all. I believe he was on a straight picket fence, so this was going to be a tough game no matter what. So I played e4, and we got the move pawn to c5, Sicilian defense, and we went into a Sherezhnikov variation, which at the time, especially after this game, I felt that my repertoire with white was a little bit lacking, and it really didn't have any lines to go for clear advantage. It was a very solid options, but again, not really fighting for the advantage. So this is something I had to work on after the tournament. But I went for this line at the time, which I played quite often. The knight dropped back to a3, b5, knight d5, f5, and I went for a very quiet pawn to g3. Pawn takes an e4 was played, bishop to g2, bishop to g7, bishop takes e4 was played, bishop e6, I played the move queen h5. So it's often very common for white to fight for the light squares in the Sherezhnikov variation such as this one, and queen h5 is just to prevent black from castling. Rook c8 was played. I played the move pawn to c3, so this knight on a3 is very badly placed and it can reroute to the e3 square. Knight e7 by Wesley, and I have to move rook to d1 to defend against the d5 square, takes, and queen to d7 was played. And here I played the move castles, which I actually spent a little bit of time on during the game, and I thought this was quite clever because if bishop g4, which was what I was trying to bait, then I would just sacrifice the exchange with the move queen to g5 here, and black can hold on to the exchange with the move pawn to f6, which both defends the bishop and attacks the queen. And after, let's say, the queen moves back somewhere, then bishop takes, and let's say I take back. I thought that white gets fantastic compensation here because of the light square weaknesses, and black can't castle the king to safety. But Wesley didn't spend any time considering that at all, and instead he just immediately played the move rook to c5 within a few seconds actually, and didn't even blink on bishop g4. So bishop takes e6, queen takes e6 was played, and I played the move knight to c2. Again, I'm trying to bring the knight into these weak light squares and try to target them, but at the moment this rook c5 move has been very good by black because black is fighting for this d5 square, and maybe one day black will push the pawn to d5. Castles, knight to e3. This time black plays f5 to take control over this f5 square, and we see that this knight doesn't have too many good squares to go to. I can't go to d5, I can't go to f5, so this is really solid play by black. Also, black is playing the move pawn to f4 next in order to chase my pieces away. If you play these sort of positions with black, then try to push your kingside pawns to get some sort of initiative going. In this position, I played the move queen h3 to try and stop this pawn advance. And then after the move e4, there's a new weakness which has been created on this f4 square, which I can perhaps take use of by playing knight g2, knight f4 in the future. But first I decided to defend the a pawn by playing a3, since b4 is often a threat by black as well. Even black can sacrifice and charge the d pawn up the board. Rook f6 was played. Now I need to be a little bit careful here because after rook f6, rook h6, my queen can be a little bit misplaced and doesn't have too many squares. I played move king h1, and after rook h6, dropped the queen back to g2. Now, if I have some time, then I will play the move pawn to f4 at some point to block everything up. If I can get away with the move pawn to f4, or even pawn to f3, then white should be okay. In general, knights are very good at blockading past pawns such as this one, and that would stop a lot of black's counterplay. Instead, black plays a very accurate move here. Wesley plays the move pawn to f4, takes, and here rook h5 looks like a good move at first, but it doesn't quite work because I think white has this knight g4 option in a lot of positions as well. So instead, we have the move rook to g6, and here I threw in pawn to f5, which was the main idea. And after rook takes f5, queen h3, the queen escapes, and after queen f3 we have a trade. And here I felt that everything was okay, even though I don't think there's too many ways for white to fight for an advantage anymore, especially after some very accurate moves by black. So bishop e5 was played, knight g4, h5, we have knight takes e5, pawn takes, rook d2, so I'm trying to get after this weak e pawn now, but e3 again, just very strong, very accurate moves played by my opponent. After rook e2, pawn takes f2, rook takes f2, rook d3, I played rook f5 to target these pawns, rook g6, again another accurate move here, just giving up these pawns and threatening some sort of back rank mates. Generally in rook endgames you want to stay as active as possible, and giving up one or two pawns usually doesn't matter if you have sufficient counterplay. So this was a good decision. I took here, check, rook goes back, and despite temporarily being a pawn up here, it doesn't really matter because black is going to win it back, and the game should fizzle out into a draw here. After the captures, there's no way to win with the h pawn. So that's a few of my favorite examples from this event. I hope you enjoyed this, and thanks for watching. I'll catch you on the next video.